Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Samir Marin. Today I want to talk about reusable workflows in GitHub Actions. A few days ago, I posted a video on how to build a CI/CD pipeline using GitHub Actions. And today I want to show you how to make a reusable workflow for that CI/CD pipeline workflow. If you're wondering to yourself, what is a reusable workflow? The simplest way to put it is the function of the GitHub Actions workflow world. So if you can imagine having 6 different service repositories that require the use of a CI/CD pipeline workflow, you could, for example, write that same workflow in each of those 6 service repositories. But that's a bit of an issue because if you had to update that workflow, you'd have to update it in 6 different places. With the reusable workflow, you keep your workflow code all in one centralized location, and you could simply call that workflow from each of your 6 repositories. So if you had to make an update to the workflow, you simply make it in the one centralized location, and that's it. It makes it much easier and much simpler, just like a function does when you're coding. So what we're going to cover in this video is we're first going to go over that CI/CD pipeline workflow that I covered in a previous video. If you want to watch that video, you can find it over here. I'm also going to place a link to that video in the description of this video. The second part is we're going to implement the reusable workflow, and then lastly we're going to call the reusable workflow from the user management service where we implemented the CI/CD pipeline workflow in the previous video. So let's get started and let's quickly go over that CI/CD pipeline workflow we covered in the previous video. Okay, so I'm sitting here in the user management service CI/CD repository, which is the repository where we implemented the CI/CD pipeline workflow. If we head over to .github/workflows, we can find the CI/CD pipeline workflow. So this was the workflow we implemented in the previous video, and we're going to quickly go over what it does. So it's a CI/CD pipeline workflow, and the first thing the CI/CD pipeline workflow does is it runs the test job. The test job is simply responsible for running the unit tests. This is a Golang service, so it runs Golang unit tests by running the go test-v /.. which is the syntax used to run all the Golang tests in the repository. The second part is it does the build, and the build is responsible for building the Docker image and pushing it to the Docker registry. In this case, we're using the GitHub Docker registry. So first it logs in, and then it builds and it pushes it to the GitHub registry. And the last part here is the delivery, which is simply responsible for updating the image of a Docker Compose file with the latest image that was just built and pushed in the previous step. In this repository, we have this deploy directory, and if you look here, there's a Docker Compose file. And simply what that step does is it updates this here with the latest tag of the image that was just built. And that's pretty much it. So what we are going to do next is we are gonna make this workflow a reusable workflow, so we can simply call that reusable workflow from here instead of writing the workflow here directly. We're simply gonna be able to call it with pretty much a couple of lines, which I'll demonstrate later on. To get started, we need a place to put our reusable workflow. And since this reusable workflow could be called by different repositories, we don't want that reusable workflow to live in this repository necessarily. We want a centralized location so that other repositories can call the reusable workflow. So we're gonna add it in a repository that I have called the GitHub Actions by example reusable workflows. And by adding it here, we can then ensure that it's in a centralized location that any other repository can call. So if you imagine you had a user management service, and then maybe you had a workout management service, both of those services could then call the reusable workflow that's going to be implemented in a reusable workflow repository. So I already have this repository cloned, and so I'm going to head over to Cursor and I'm going to start implementing the reusable workflow. So I'm sitting here in Cursor. I am in the GitHub Actions by example reusable workflow repository, and I have here the .github/workflows directories, which is where the reusable workflows are going to live. You can see I already have one implemented here, but I'm going to implement a new one. And so to do that, I'm simply going to add a new file under the workflows directory, and I'm going to call this file CI/CD pipeline.yaml. Actually, I'm going to call it reusable CI/CD pipeline.yaml. Okay, the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna copy the code of the CI/CD pipeline workflow directly into this file, and then I'm gonna make some updates to make it a reusable workflow. Okay, so I'm back in the user management service CI/CD repository, and I'm gonna grab this workflow. I'm just gonna copy everything in the workflow. Then I'm gonna head back to cursor, and I'm gonna copy it directly here. Now we need to ensure this becomes a reusable workflow. And to do that, we need to change the triggers. Okay, so instead of the pull request triggers, we want the workflow call triggers. So cursor is actually pretty good at giving us what we want. And then under here, we define some input. Let's take the cursor's suggestion for now, and then we'll update if needed. Okay, so essentially the pattern here is we're gonna have this on workflow call trigger, which is the way that we implement a reusable workflow. And then we're gonna have a bunch of inputs that are gonna allow us to make our reusable workflow customizable, because different repositories may have different requirements. And so just like when you create a function and you want to pass different inputs to that function depending on how that function is going to be utilized, a reusable workflow works the same way. You have inputs that allow you to customize the way that the workflow is going to be utilized. And so to figure out exactly what we need to head over to our jobs. So this jobs part is basically going to stay the same, other than we're going to replace some of these different parts with the inputs here. So let's just go through. So the first thing is we check out the code. We don't really need to worry about any inputs there, because that's going to be the same for any CI/CD pipeline. We set up Go. We could, for example, do something here if we wanted to make this reusable workflow available for different languages. So if you had a repository maybe in Python, you wouldn't want to set up Go, you want to set up Python. But I'm going to assume that all our repositories that are going to be using this repository workflow are going to be Go repositories. So we're going to leave this part alone. The next part is the Docker Compose up. Now this part here, we could assume that potentially it's going to be the same for all services that are going to use this reusable workflow, but there is a possibility that maybe we want to pass a different command here, maybe a file path to a different Docker Compose file. So this is probably a good candidate to use an input for. So we can see here that cursor already suggested the Docker Compose command as an input, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So we have Docker Compose command. We're going to say false, not required, and we're going to default to the Docker Compose up-d, which is for decache. And instead of having this here, we're going to call the input. So that's the first part of that. So now we'll default to what we had here before, but if someone wants to change it, they can pass in a different command, maybe a file path to the Docker Compose command. Cursor also suggested setting this as an environment variable, but I don't really want to do that, so I'm just going to delete this. Okay, the next part here is the test step. And there is a possibility that this test step may not require the same command for each repo that's going to use this reusable workflow. So it probably makes sense to add a command here as well. So we can call this the test script input. And this will essentially do exactly what we did before, is we'll have the default, what we have written in this step right now. We'll say that it's not required by default, but if someone wants to use a different command to run the test, they can pass it in as an input. And then what we do is we come down here and we replace that with the inputs test script, so that it can use whatever is given as an input or the default. And these environment variables, we could potentially make these inputs as well, but just to keep this simple, I'm gonna leave these as is, and I'm gonna assume that whoever is gonna utilize the reusable workflow will be able to use these environment variables as they are. Okay, so let's move on to the build. So for the build, we have the checkout code. Once again, we can leave that alone, assume that any reusable workflow is just gonna utilize that as is. And the next part is the Docker meta. And we could probably utilize some inputs here, because this is what decides the tag of the image as well as the path of the image. And potentially we want to allow the user to override that path. So what we can do is we can create this as an input, we can create this as an input, and then we could also have the tags as an input. So let's go back up to the inputs and let's do build, and then let's actually do build owner, so that way the person that's overriding could override either the repository owner and the repository name. And so for build owner, this is the repository owner of the org or username, and so by default we'll default what we're using below, and we won't require it, so it won't be required, but it'll default to what we're using below. And then the second part, which is the repository name, we could call it the build name as Cursor suggested for us. And then let's take these suggestions, and so the repository name, which we called build name, and we'll take the default what we're using below, which is the GitHub event repository name, but the user can pass something to it like this as well. Now for the build tags, once again, the default will be what we're using below, but we'll allow the user to pass in something different if they want these tags to be different. So if, for example, they didn't want to use the SHA of the commit as an image tag, they wouldn't have to. If they didn't want to include the branch, they wouldn't have to. They could override these with whatever they wanted. And then if we go back down, we now have set up QEMU, and that we can leave alone and assume that that's going to be the same for anybody using the workflow. We have the Docker build X, which we can leave alone and assume that's going to be the same for anybody using the workflow. And then now we have the login. And for the login, we could potentially allow the user to override the registry and the username and the password so that a different registry could be used, but I'm going to leave it as is and assume that anyone using this reusable workflow is gonna use this Docker registry, so there won't be a need to override the registry or the login information. And now the last part here is the build and push. So one thing we can do is we could have an input for the push. So by default we can say, okay, this will only be pushed if it's not a pull request event, but we can allow an override for that. So let's go back to the inputs, build push. Let's take these suggestions, and the default will be if it's not a pull request event, it's true, but if someone wants to override that and push it always or never push, they could, or have a different kind of logic to check whether it should be pushed or not, they could as well. And then for all these other ones, these are using steps from the meta, which is the meta step, so that we can leave alone. Steps from the meta, the labels, we can leave that alone, and the platforms we can also leave alone. Okay, so that does it for the build job in terms of inputs. Oh no, sorry, I need to update the push to now be an input. So here we can then utilize the inputs. So inputs dot build push, because we want to use the input passed by the user or the default if nothing is passed. And I actually forgot to update all these other ones as well. So Cursor here is actually giving us some pretty good suggestions. So we want to update that to inputs build owner, which was what we named our input. Let's just double check that's what we named it. Input build owner, yep, and then build name. Perfect. So that was updated correctly, and then also inputs build tags was also updated correctly. Okay, and here Cursor, notice I made a mistake because it should be a dash and not an underscore. So that's exactly what we need. Okay, so we've updated all our inputs. If I'm not mistaken, let's just make sure the build owner, the build name, and the build tags, and then the build push. Now we can move on to the delivery job. Okay, so the delivery job, once again, the checkout step can stay the same. We don't need to worry about that. The set image reference, which is the way we lowercase the owner and the repo name, for that we can utilize the build inputs as well. So because the GitHub event repository owner login was the same we default to in the build owner, and the build name is the same one we default to here, so we can just utilize these two inputs for that part as well. So let's do that. So let's change this to inputs build owner and this to inputs build name. And now we are in the update deployment YAML step, which is the one where we update the Docker Compose, and we can do a few things here. So by default, we're saying that the Docker Compose file we're going to update is under deploy/dockercompose.yaml. We can make that an input. So let's go up to the inputs and do that. So you can call this deploy Docker Compose file. And it's exactly what Cursor suggested. So by default, it'll be deploy/dockercompose.yaml. But if we want to override the default, we can pass in an input. And then we just want to make sure we update that. But before that, let's go over all the ones we're gonna update. Okay, for the property path, we probably want to provide an input there as well, because this uses the name of the service that is using the Docker Compose. So this will probably be different depending on the service using the reusable workflow. So what we can do is we can come up to the inputs and we can have deploy, and then we can do a service name. And what we'll actually do in this case is we'll require it, because for sure it won't ever be the same. So we want the user to provide the service name. What we could actually do is we can default to the repository name, assuming that's the service name, and allow the user to override it if that's not the service name. So for that, we can say the default is the same as the build name here, which is the repository name. And if the user wants to override that, they can. And then below, we can update that to be used here. So inputs deploy service name.image, and then here we want to update the deploy Docker Compose file. So that works for this. We can leave this alone because we're using the steps from here to get the lowercase for both of these. And for the commit message, we can make that inputs as well. So let's update these to the inputs that it suggests. The inputs deploy commit essentially says that it should commit the message and create PR if it's true, and if it's false, we can default to what we had there before here. So we can create deploy commit, and if it's not a pull request, we default to true, and same with the deploy create PR. If it's not a pull request event, we can default to true. So that allows us to use that by default, but if a user wants to pass in a different value, they can. And that pretty much does it. We could also provide, for example, different inputs for the messages and a few other things. Really, even the main branch can change if we wanted to here, but we're going to assume that anybody using this reusable workflow is just going to take all these others by default. It's really just like a function. You kind of have to decide, what am I going to allow as inputs for this function so that the user can customize how this function is used. There's always that question of how much customization should I add to this function? Is it worth making it very customizable, which in turn makes it more complex? Or should we just build another function that's similar but handles a different scenario? So in this case, we're gonna make it somewhat customizable, but obviously there's room to make it some more, but we're just gonna assume that whoever is gonna be using this reusable workflow will only need to customize these parameters. So let's leave that at that, and let's commit this up and make a PR. Okay, so I'm here in the terminal and I'm gonna push up the reusable workflow code and make a pull request out of it. So first thing, I'm gonna create a branch because I'm in the main branch right now, and I do not wanna push this up to the main branch right now. I wanna create a PR first, and I'm gonna say CI CD pipeline reusable workflow. And then I'm going to add the file I just added. So git add, it's under GitHub workflows reusable CI/CD pipeline YAML, and I'm gonna commit this. Git commit add CI/CD reusable workflow, and I will push. Okay, so the PR is open. Well, actually, I gotta open it by creating it. And now that it's created, we are going to just quickly look over it to make sure it has what we want. What we're gonna do now is we're gonna test this workflow. Before that, I just noticed I did make a mistake. Originally, I wanted to make deploy service name a required parameter, but then I decided that we could default to the name of the repository. So what I will actually do is I'll make this false. So I'm gonna go back and do that really quickly before we test this out. Okay, and I'm gonna push that up. Okay, perfect. Now, the way to test this is we head over to the user management service CI/CD. So if we open this up in cursor, we have the CI/CD pipeline here. And now the idea is that instead of us having to write the workflow here, we can simply call the reusable workflow from here. And so the way we do that is we pretty much can keep this the same. The trigger is the same because this is still a workflow that's going to be calling a reusable workflow. So we still need the workflow to trigger on a pull request, and we need it to trigger on a push event as well. We want the permissions all to be there. Actually, I think we placed the permissions in the reusable workflow, so we don't actually need them here, though we could have them here if they were not in the reusable workflow, but they are, so we can essentially delete pretty much everything. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have jobs, and then we can have a job called the CI/CD pipeline. And what we do is we use the uses keyword, and we reference the reusable workflow file by starting with the GitHub user or the organization if you're in an organization. So in this case, it'd be Samir Marin, GitHub Actions by example reusable workflows dot GitHub, because that's the directory it's under, workflows reusable CI/CD pipeline. And now here we can see cursor suggesting the use of a tag, but what we can actually do is we can put the branch name for now so that we can test if this works without the need to build a tag just yet. And so if we go back to the pull request, we can see that the branch name is CI/CD pipeline reusable workflow. So we can use that branch name back to cursor directly here. And we can test this out to see if this now works. Now you can see that instead of writing the whole workflow here, now we simply make one call to the reusable workflow, and this will run the workflow for us. So if we had multiple repos that require the use of this CI/CD pipeline workflow, it makes it very easy, because now it's like calling a function. You simply write one line and you call the workflow, as opposed to having to write each of those steps and jobs all in here for each of the repos that require a CI/CD pipeline workflow. So let's test this out. Let's go back to the terminal. Let's make a branch. And then we are going to add our changes. So we essentially deleted everything and simply called the reusable workflow. Let's commit this. And let's push it up. And then let's open that pull request. Okay, and that's it. And so because that reusable workflow runs, well, I guess not the reusable workflow, because this workflow runs on a pull request and a push event, this should have triggered already. Because if we go back here and we look, we can see that we left the triggers for the pull requests and the push event. So if we go to actions, we should see this run. Okay, so we ran into an error, so let's see what that is about. And it looks like I was actually wrong, and we do need to give the workflow, calling the reusable workflow, the permission. So let's add those back into our workflow. So we can come here, we can do permissions, and we want contents right, pull requests right, issues right, and packages right. And let's try that again by pushing another commit. Give the proper permissions to the workflow. Okay, so hopefully that fixes our issue and the call to the reusable workflow is successful. Let's go take a look. So that should have started another one. Okay, now it's running. So as you can see, we updated the pull request here to simply use the reusable workflow. So we deleted all the logic of the workflow and we made a one-line change to call the reusable workflow. And if we look at what's currently running, you can see that it's the CI/CD pipeline, where we have the test job, the build job, and the delivery job. So let's just wait for that to run. Okay, so we actually ran into another issue, and it seems like the way we are calling the update to the Docker Compose is not quite working. So let's try and fix that. So if we go back to cursor, we can see that we are simply passing in the input deploy service name, which is the repository name, I believe. Yes. And if we go back and look at our PR, the old code, so back to the pull request. So potentially the issue is that this code is actually under quotations, and we did not do that. So let's try that and see if that fixes the issue. Okay, let's try to put this under quotations. Okay, so it's in quotes, and now let's push this back up and see if that fixes our issue. So we've put quotes around it, wrap quotes, the service name, let's push it up, and then that updates our reusable workflow, which is this one, but we also need to trigger our workflow again so that we can test to see if this change actually fixed it. So we can do that with a dummy commit. We can say git commit, allow empty, trigger. So this will essentially make an empty commit so that we can trigger the workflow again. Okay, so that should have retriggered the workflow, and let's see if that fixes it. Okay, so that fixed the issue. The pipeline ran all the way through. Now this was a pull request event, so not every part of the pipeline runs because we have some conditions that don't trigger when it's a pull request event. For example, we don't push the image when it's a pull request event, and we also don't make a pull request for the update to the Docker Compose file when it's a pull request event. So to test the full flow, we will actually have to merge. But before we do that, I do want to do a few things. First thing is I want to pass an input to our workflow because currently we are running the workflow without inputs, and one of the defaults is that the Docker Compose file, when updating the image, goes to the repository name. If you recall, if we go back to the reusable workflow, we say inputs deploy service, which by default is the repository name, but the repository name is actually user management service -CI/CD, which is not what we want. So we want to override that input with the actual name of the service found in the Docker Compose file. So the way to do that is to go back to our workflow and use the with, and here we can say deploy service name, and that will be user management service, and that's about it. So now we will actually use the name of the Docker Compose file. So in the Docker Compose file, we're using user management service, not user management service .CI/CD, and so that is why we want to pass in that input so that it uses the correct name and is able to actually find the image to update, because if not, it would never find it, it could never update this tag. And so let's push that change back up. Okay, so that's that. And then now that we've tested on a pull request event, we can merge this change to test that the image is pushed, and then that will essentially validate for us that our reusable workflow works. We'll first wait for this to run all the way through, and then we will merge in our pull request, and what we should see is a image being pushed up like we did when we were running the CI/CD pipeline, and which is to see a pull request updating the Docker Compose file. Okay, so this is all running great when we use a pull request event. Now what we want to do is we want to merge this PR, and we want to validate that an image is built, an image is pushed to the registry, and a PR is created updating the Docker Compose file, all using the reusable workflow. So let's merge this. This will trigger a push event since it's a push to the main branch, and so this validates that the reusable workflow CI/CD pipeline can run all the way through, can build the image, it can push the image, and it can build a pull request updating the Docker Compose file. So let's wait for this to finish running, and then we'll validate those three things. Okay, so this is done running on the push event. So the first thing we're going to do is validate that the image was pushed up. So if we come over to the packages and the user management CI/CD package, we can see that there was something published a minute ago, and this is the tag for that. So let's copy that tag and validate that this tag is the tag that our Docker Compose file was updated to. So we can see that there was a pull request created with a new tag, and it is exactly the tag that we just pushed up. So as you can see, we just updated our CI/CD pipeline workflow to use the reusable workflow, and now instead of having the whole code in this repository for the user management service CI/CD, we can simply call the reusable workflow with a one-liner. We can pass in the inputs. In this case, it's just one input, and we took the defaults for the rest. And you can imagine that if you had multiple repositories that needed a CI/CD pipeline, you would simply just do this for each one, pass in the inputs that you require instead of having to write a whole CI/CD pipeline and copy and paste lots of redundant code between repo to repo. So that is what reusable workflows are all about. Before we wrap up, let's actually clean up our reusable workflow repository, because what we actually want to do is merge the pull requests so that we can utilize a tag. Because if you recall, what we're doing right now is we're simply referencing the branch name of the PR. And while that works just fine, that is not best practice. The best thing to do is use a tag of the current release. So if we look at this PR, there is some logic in this repository that auto creates releases for us and therefore allows us to utilize a tag reference the reusable workflow. So as soon as we merge this, there will be a tag available for us to use, and we will update that in our user management service CI/CD repo so that we're not referencing simply the branch name. So let's merge this, and once again, just to remind you, this is the reusable workflow that we created, and it lives in the centralized repo called GitHub Actions by example reusable workflows. So we're going to merge this, and when this is merged, there's an action that's going to run that's going to release this workflow for us. I'm not going to go over the workflow that releases this workflow for us in this video. Maybe it's something I'll do in a future video, but I will show you how to manually create a release if you don't have automation to release a workflow for you. First, let's wait for this to run and make our release. Okay, so that's done. So it should have released our CI/CD pipeline. So you can see here release. So CI/CD pipeline version 0.0.1, and that is the version we are going to use in our user management service. So let's head back over to the terminal. We are in the user management service CI/CD. Let's actually grab the main branch. Okay, so let's make a new branch. Let's go back to cursor and let's open up the CI/CD pipeline workflow. And so this is where we are referencing our reusable workflow. So instead of referencing the CI/CD pipeline reusable workflow branch, which we were before, we are going to reference that tag. And so that tag is simply this here. And then what that ensures is if the reusable workflow was to be updated, unless we intend to override this tag with the new update, there would be a new release, which might be v0.0.2, and therefore if there were breaking changes potentially, there would be no issues because we're still referencing this particular release. The whole idea is we have a control of what is being used for the reusable workflow in each repository, as opposed to randomly taking the latest version in a branch that's happening, because that could cause a breakage if the updates to the repo are breaking changes. Okay, so let's commit this back to the terminal. Open up that pull request. Okay, so this is simply just updating it to use the release tag after we merge the reusable workflow. Doesn't make any changes to the reusable workflow, so this should work just fine. So I'm not gonna wait for the pull request event to finish running. I'm simply just gonna merge this in. Okay, so as promised, I will show you how to make a release when there is no automation for a release. So right now, like I mentioned, I have some automation in this repository under workflows that release all the reusable workflows anytime we merge a reusable workflow into the reusable workflow repo. But if you didn't have this automation, you could do this manually. What you would do is you would go to the releases here. You're in the repo. You go to the releases, you would then draft a new release. You could then select a tag. As you can see, we previously released the CI/CD pipeline -v 0.0.1. And so say for example, we do not have a tag available to use, we could have it create a tag for us. So just as an example, say I want to create a new CI/CD pipeline reusable workflow, and it's going to be v2. So it'd be reusable pipeline v2, and then I could say v0.0.1, and then here I could say create new tag on publish. So I'll choose that. I'm going to target the main branch, essentially saying whatever is the latest code in main is what I want this tag to reference, and then I could give it a release title. It could be whatever I want. I could say release CI/CD pipeline v2, and you could also include the particular version here if you want. And then you could describe what this does. It releases the v0.0.1 version of CI/CD pipeline v2. And then you could set it as the latest release, which is what you'd want to do normally, and you publish the release. And that's pretty much it. So now you've published a release, and there's a tag that's linked to that release, which you can utilize just like we did when we were referencing the latest release on the CI/CD pipeline v0.0.1 that we had created for us via the automation. So this is how you would do it manually if you didn't have automation, and that's pretty much what the automation does. Okay, so just to cover what we just did, we took the CI/CD pipeline workflow, which I built in a previous video. I am placing a link to that video in the description if you want to watch it. And we build a reusable workflow in a different repository, which is a reusable workflow repository, so that we could call that reusable workflow from the user management service CI/CD repo without having to write the workflow code in that repo. And why this is useful is because instead of having to write a CI/CD pipeline workflow for each repository that requires a CI/CD pipeline workflow, we can simply write the CI/CD pipeline workflow in one location, the reusable workflow location, and call that reusable workflow from each of our repositories with a couple of lines. It works much like a function does, where you simply call the function and pass in some inputs. The reusable workflow works much the same. You call the function, you can pass in inputs to override the default inputs, so that you can customize how the reusable workflow runs, but it saves us from having to repeat a bunch of code in each repository that requires a given GitHub action workflow. So I hope you enjoyed this video, that you found it useful. If you like my content, you can check out some of my other videos over here, and I will catch you in the next one. Bye bye.